Welcome everybody to the Brain Performance Institute and our Sips in Science. And I don't even like to say lecture series because it's not a lecture. Let's call it more of a discussion. I do see many familiar names, but I think, where are we now? Almost to 600 people logging in. So thank you from all over the country. And I think we have some international people logging in as well. I just want everyone to know a few ground rules before Jen introduces Dr. Brewer. First, we do record these lectures. And so those will be made available to you later by a link, and you'll be able to see those on our BrainHealth YouTube page. So by next week or the end of this week, you should be getting a link for that. We'll also be having a question and answer session at the end of the discussion. We're going to try to save 15, 20 minutes for that. So the chat box is turned off, but the Q&A box is there if you do have a question that you would like us to present to Dr. Brewer at the end of the, and we won't be able to get to all of them, but please feel free to do that. So I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer Zients, our Deputy Director and Head Clinician here at the Brain Performance Institute. She's been here since we started. So thank you, Jen, take it away.
You got it. Thanks everyone for being here. For those of you who are new and those of you who are have been joining us all along, just as a reminder, Sips in Science and the Brain Performance Institute itself. The Brain Performance Institute is a translational arm of the Center for Brain Health. And this Sips in Science the goal is to be able to make research and science accessible to the public. And so we are so glad that all of you are joining us tonight. Dr. Judd Brewer is one of the scientists and researchers that I've met through my whole career who is translation is the name of the game. And we were talking earlier just about responsibility of scientists and researchers is to make our information translatable, to make it accessible to others. And he does a splendid job of it. So I want to introduce him. He has an incredible CV. Some of the really highlight points, I think Dr. Brewer is a thought leader in the field of habit change and the science of self-mastery. He's the Director of Research and Innovation at the Center for Mindfulness at Brown University School of Public Health. He's an Associate Professor in Psychiatry at the School of Medicine. He's also a research affiliate at MIT. He has published numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. He's trained US Olympic coaches. He's worked with lots of people. He's developed and tested novel programs for habit change, delivered both in person and on the app. He does work in fMRI and EEG, so looking at behavior as well as imaging. And as I mentioned before, his new book, Unwinding Anxiety, has just come out. I believe it was last week. I got mine last week. And he has an app by the same name of Unwinding Anxiety. And very importantly and proudly, he is one of our collaborators on the Brain Health Project. And so we are so fortunate to be able to partner with him. And so Dr. Brewer, welcome. And we cannot wait to hear from you tonight.
Thank you. What a wonderful introduction. And it is great to be here. I'll jump right in because there's a lot I'd like to share, and I really want to leave a lot of time for us to have a conversation rather than just me giving a talk. So I will share my slides and we will get started. Okay. So just to get some of the housekeeping out of the way, as Jennifer mentioned, I've had the great fortune of my lab pairing with a company to study some of the digital therapeutics that have been developed. So all of those financial interests are being managed by Brown University. Also, as she mentioned, I have a new book that just came out, so I get royalties from that, and I should mention that as well. And the talk today will actually touch on some of the concepts that I'll actually talk about in the book. I thought I would start with a story of a patient that I've been seeing in my clinic. When he was first referred to me, he was just referred with the tagline or the chief complaint of anxiety. When he came into my office, I could see that he was anxious. And when he sat down and I started taking his history, he described to me how he would be driving on the highway and then he would get these thoughts. He described it as feeling like he was in a speeding bullet. And he started to get really afraid that he might get in a car accident. This led him to stop driving on the highway and even being nervous driving on local roads, to the point where he developed full-blown panic disorder. He also had generalized anxiety disorder. This gentleman was about 40 years of age, and he had the generalized anxiety probably for about 30 years and didn't know what to do about it. The other thing I can mention about him was that he was very overweight. So we can ask ourselves, I can ask myself as a clinician, how do I treat my patients with anxiety and or obesity? Well, just to give you a sense for how well we are doing with this as a society, there's this term in medicine called number needed to treat, which basically gives us a sense for how well a treatment works to significantly reduce symptoms. With anxiety, medication treatment, that number needed to treat is 5.15, meaning I have to treat over 5 patients before one of them shows a significant benefit. And I like this cartoon because I started getting anxious about how to treat my patients with anxiety because, I'm playing the medication lottery and that's not very satisfying. What about the other 80% of my folks that don't do particularly well? How about obesity? This was a graph that was put up a couple of years ago, suggesting that, the approaches that we've taken for obesity, for example, just make sure you eat salad instead of cake, basically make sure you have more calories out than in. That formula has been accurate and correct since the 70s and forever. I learned this in medical school myself. Yet knowing this formula, it doesn't seem to help us actually change behavior. So this gets at this question, what are we missing? And I like this quote from Einstein. He said, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it, because it points out to a big approach that we've been taking, which is using willpower to change behavior, whether it's quitting smoking, stop overeating, or even making ourselves not worry. Yet, ironically, the cognitive control parts of our brain are seated in the prefrontal cortex, which is the youngest and the weakest part of our brain from an evolutionary perspective. It's the first part of the brain that goes offline when we get stressed. So what I would suggest is maybe we're not actually understanding or paying attention to some of these core elements of how our brains work. I'm going to show you a very short animation that highlights some of this background that we put together and also highlights how this even applies in this pandemic that we are still going through.
Anxiety gone viral. Why fear and uncertainty spread anxiety through social contagion, and how to protect yourself. Anxiety is a strange beast. As a psychiatrist, I've learned that anxiety and its close cousin panic are both born from fear. As a behavioral neuroscientist, I know that fear's main evolutionary function is helping us survive. In fact, fear is the oldest survival mechanism we've got. Fear helps us learn to avoid dangerous situations in the future through a process called negative reinforcement. For example, if we step out into a busy street, turn our head and see a car coming right at us, we instinctively jump back onto the safety of the sidewalk. Evolution made this really simple for us. So simple that we only need 3 elements in situations like this to learn: an environmental cue, a behavior, and a result. In this case, walking up to a busy street cues us to look both ways before crossing. The result of not getting killed helps us remember to repeat the action again in the future. Sometime in the last million years, humans evolved a new layer on top of our more primitive survival brain, called the prefrontal cortex. Involved in creativity and planning, the prefrontal cortex helps us think and plan for the future. It predicts what will happen in the future based on past experience. If we don't have enough information, our prefrontal cortex lays out different scenarios about what might happen next and guesses which will be most likely. It does this by running simulations based on previous events that are most similar. Enter anxiety. Anxiety is defined as a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. Anxiety comes up when our prefrontal cortices don't have enough information to accurately predict the future. We saw this with the novel coronavirus that was discovered in China at the end of 2019, COVID-19. Scientists raced to study the characteristics of any new virus so that we can know precisely how contagious and deadly it is, and act accordingly. Uncertainty abounds. Without accurate information, it is easy for our brains to spin stories of fear and dread. In addition to being fueled by uncertainty, anxiety is also contagious. In psychology, the spread of emotion from one person to another is termed social contagion. Our own anxiety can be cued or triggered simply by talking to someone else who is anxious. Their fearful words are like a sneeze landing directly on our brain, emotionally infecting our prefrontal cortex and sending it out of control as it worries about everything from whether our family members will get sick to how our jobs will be affected. Wall Street is a great example of social contagion. We watch the stock market spike and crash, the stock indices being a thermometer for how feverish our collective anxiety is at any one moment. Wall Street even has something known as the Fear Index, which with coronavirus outstripped the financial meltdown of 2008. When we can't control our anxiety, that emotional fever spikes into panic. Panic is defined as sudden, uncontrollable fear or anxiety, often causing wildly unthinking behavior. Overwhelmed by uncertainty and fear of the future, the rational thinking parts of our brains go offline when we're panicked. Logically, we know that we don't need a 6-month supply of toilet paper, but when we see someone else's cart piled high, their anxiety infects us, and we go into survival mode. So how do we not panic? Too many times I've seen my anxious clinic patients try to suppress or think themselves out of anxiety. Unfortunately, both willpower and reasoning rely on the prefrontal cortex, which isn't available at these critical moments. Instead, I start by teaching them how their brain works, so that they can see how uncertainty weakens the brain's ability to deal with stress, priming it for anxiety when fear hits.
So that's a little crash course, and here's the summary. So basically, we have this old survival brain. It's seated more in the limbic system. And then we've got this new brain, the neocortex, that's layered on top of it that helps us think and plan for the future. So what are we doing to help us work with anxiety, to work with other types of habits? We've seen a lot of habits start to develop or get worse during this pandemic, where anxiety triggers stress eating or drinking or binge watching Netflix or whatever. Well, this was a question that somebody had been very, very interested in way back in the 50s. This is B.F. Skinner. You might recognize him, or his pigeons may give it away. He was very interested in what makes animals behave. In fact, here's a shot from the Skinner archives. He found that he could teach a pigeon to win a cross-court shot in ping pong for a food reward. Now, pigeons aren't particularly prone to playing ping pong, but they will play for food. And what he learned and started to bring out into the scientific public was this idea of positive and negative reinforcement, that we'll do something that keeps a good thing going, and we'll also, that's positive reinforcement, and we'll also do something to make unpleasant things go away. So you would think, well, we're humans, we're not pigeons, or are we? Here's a Weight Watchers commercial.
If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're happy and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad because you're angry, feeling down, or generally bad, if you're sad, eat a snack. If you're bored and you know it, eat a snack. If you're lonely and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sleepy and you know it, if you're guilty and you know it, if you're stressed, eat a snack. If you're human and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're human, eat your feelings, eat a snack.
If you're human, eat your feelings, eat a snack. So whoever it was that made that commercial was brilliant, because they were really highlighting these cause and effect relationships that come in positive and negative reinforcement. And in fact, this is a very, very well worked out science. So you can think of the positive reinforcement side, if you eat a good meal, it feels good. So you have an urge to have dessert, or if something good happens, you eat, you party by eating pizza or whatever, and then this reinforces the process. Or if you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. You can see how that works. Now, from a scientific standpoint, it's really helpful to have these theories in mind as I'm trying to research developing good methods for treating these problems. As a clinician, it's also helpful to keep this in mind so I can see where my patients are struggling. So for example, my patients with alcohol use disorder, there's a saying, people, places, and things. If you avoid cues, you're less likely to drink, which makes a lot of sense. If my patients are trying to quit smoking, it's harder to avoid all the places that they smoke. So here we can often employ substitute behaviors. Yet neither of these dismantle this habit loop at its core. So what I would suggest is, really understanding this process can really help give us a start into working with it. And we can even simplify this. This goes back to this core problem of our survival brains trying to remember where food is and avoid danger, a trigger, a behavior, and a reward. And for example, with food, that reward is our stomach sending this dopamine signal to our brain that says, remember what you ate and where you found it. So it's more set up to help us remember things than be rewarding per se. So who knows about this? Well, the food industry knows a whole lot about this. They've actually designed things to be food-like to get us addicted. This great New York Times expose talked about this years ago. I love how they use the Doritos as their cover art, because this is really the epitome of something that is designed to be the perfect feel, mouthfeel, taste, crunch, etc., to get us addicted. We also see this in social media, where social media is designed for the likes and retweets. So, I would suggest that we know actually a whole lot about how the mind works, and we can use this in various ways. Just to summarize, the poor Cookie Monster, we can kind of see, if we can understand this process, we can see how we get addicted to all sorts of things, from smoking to eating to social media. And if we can understand the process, then we can start to work with it. And this is where some really interesting work that my lab and other labs has done, comes into play here. So I'm sure many folks have heard the term mindfulness. John Kabat-Zinn really brought this into the Western world with his mindfulness-based stress reduction program that he started in the 70s. He talks about mindfulness as being, where we can pay attention in the present moment on purpose and non-judgmentally. Now, how does that actually work in terms of changing behavior? I think of it as instead of avoiding things or substituting behaviors, driving this wedge of awareness in so that we can respond with awareness rather than habitually react. Now, does this actually work? You're thinking, well, paying attention, how does this help me change behavior? So we took one of the hardest addictions to work with, which is smoking, and we did a randomized controlled trial with people who are trying to quit smoking. I won't go through all the details because we published this a while ago, but I think this really highlights a core principle, which is awareness is really critical for any type of behavior change. And there's a critical aspect of what happens here. So as folks go through our program, we have them pay attention as they smoke, and they start to realize that smoking actually tastes pretty crappy. And I highlight this because reward-based learning isn't based on a behavior. If we wanted to change a behavior and all we had to do was focus on the behavior, my patients would come into my office and I would say, just stop smoking, just stop overeating, just stop worrying. There's actually a great Bob Newhart skit from the 70s called Just Stop It, where basically patient comes into the therapist's office and that's what he does. I'd highly recommend it. It's worth taking a look at, but it also highlights how much we've been approaching these things through the lens of willpower. Yet that's not how our brains work. Our brains work based on how rewarding a behavior is. So if we can help people pay attention to how rewarding something is, then we have a possibility of actually changing that. Just to give you, an idea for this, I love this quote from Yogi Berra: you can observe a lot just by watching. Now, just to highlight this, one of our first studies, this was published 10 years ago now, we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment by having people bring awareness to what was happening, to the process, and then also to use mindfulness to write out cravings. Now, this was encouraging to us, and I won't go into all the details. When we looked at this mechanistically, we actually found that this wedge of awareness could dismantle this link between craving and smoking in this case. So that was encouraging. Now, at the time, I started to think about this process, and I was thinking, well, my patients don't learn to smoke in my office. They're actually learning these behaviors in a specific context. And at the time, the iPhone was starting to get rolled out in 2010, 2011. And I started thinking, well, could I do something to package my office and deliver it to my patients at their fingertips? So we started developing digital therapeutics. Our first one was for smoking, called Craving to Quit. Second one was for eating, called Eat Right Now. And the third one was for anxiety, called Unwinding Anxiety. And the way that these work is, well, I'll pause here and say, well, how is anxiety linked to habits? There's an overlooked literature from the 80s suggesting that, in fact, anxiety can be negatively reinforced through the process of worrying as a mental behavior. So we worry, it makes us feel like we're in control. Yet when we realize that the worrying doesn't actually give us control, for example, if our kids are teenagers and they're out driving around on the weekend at night, our worrying about them being safe isn't going to keep them safe. It's just going to keep us up and actually feed back and make us more anxious. So I would suggest that we could actually throw anxiety into this mix and start to see if we can address anxiety in the same way as other habits. So what do these programs look like? Well, we can give people gradual trainings because they're developed and delivered right through their phones. Give them trainings on how to understand their minds, give them some mindfulness training as well. These can be short bite-sized pieces, so people can use these within the context of their very busy days. We can use animations to drive the key points home. And then importantly, we can give them in the moment exercises so that they don't have to run to my office, to calm down, or call their therapist, or take a benzodiazepine, which are not first-line treatment recommendations anymore, but they can really start to work with their own minds. And of course, as a scientist, I like to do things like embed experience sampling tools so we can actually test to see if these things work. We can also pair these with online communities where folks can get peer support, and folks like me can also moderate these communities and answer questions. We can even have a live weekly group via Zoom where anybody in the world can join, and we can answer questions and help folks out. So these platforms are immensely scalable, and we can test to see how well they work. I'll give you an example of our eating program, and I'll highlight a patient that I saw in my clinic as I was starting to develop the Eat Right Now program. This was a woman who was about 30 and was referred to me for binge eating disorder. And she described how she had been binging for probably about 20 years. And it started when her mom started to emotionally abuse her, let's put it that way. And she found that if she ate food, she could numb herself, as she put it, from those negative emotions. By the time she came to see me, she was binging on entire large pizzas 20 out of 30 days a month. So you can see how she'd gotten caught up in this loop. She didn't know how her mind worked. But if we just map this out, we can see her negative emotions were leading her to binge, which would give her this brief relief where she would numb herself, yet it wasn't actually fixing the root cause of her problem. And the bottom line here was that she just didn't know how her mind worked. So long story short, if we can bring awareness into this process, if we can teach people how their minds work, maybe they can work with them. So in a study led by Ashley Mason at UCSF, we looked to see, could people use mindfulness-based, and mindfulness-based app to help them learn how their minds work with their habit loops around eating. And lo and behold, we could do this. We got a 40% reduction in craving-related eating and a 35% reduction in eating to cope with negative emotions. So that was very encouraging because it was suggesting that mechanistically we were seeing very similar effects as we could see with our smoking program. And then somebody asked, well, I'm actually realizing that anxiety is driving me to stress eat. Can you develop a program for anxiety? And this is when I went back and looked at the literature.
and found the work by Borkovic and others that had been largely neglected since the 80s. And I said, oh, habits, I know something about habits. Can we actually apply this to anxiety? So we developed an app called Unlearning Anxiety, and we started with physicians who are really challenging to work with. They often don't have time. We learn in medical school to armor up, to kind of put our emotions to the side so that we can be out there helping our patients, the proverbial saving lives. So we figured, well, if we could work with a challenging population, maybe this could work for other people as well. So long story short, we published a study just last year with anxious physicians, and this was a small single-arm trial that we found significant reductions in anxiety. Here we got a 57% reduction in these clinically validated anxiety scores in as few as 3 months. So that was promising, though it was only a single arm. So we got some funding from the NIH, and we did a randomized controlled trial in people with generalized anxiety disorder. Long story short, we got a 67% reduction in anxiety at 2 months. Here you can see the folks that got their standard clinical care didn't really change their anxiety. They changed their anxiety a little bit, which is good because they're getting treatment. Yet it wasn't nearly as robust as when they got that treatment plus the Unlearning Anxiety app. And here we could calculate the number needed to treat. If you remember at the beginning of the talk, I have to treat 5 patients with medication before one shows a significant benefit. Here, that treatment number goes down to 1.6. So that was really, really encouraging for us. So just to summarize all of this, what this suggests is that we actually do know a whole lot about how the mind works, going back to positive and negative reinforcement. And if we can target those mechanisms, we can actually see robust changes in behavior, whether it's smoking or overeating or anxiety. So how does this actually work? I'm just going to walk you through what I've started to see as these 3 steps of habit change. And over the last decade or so, seeing this so consistently, this is actually what prompted me to write this new book, Unwinding Anxiety, that talks about how we can overcome anxiety, but also other habits through a very simple 3-step process. So the first step is becoming aware of being caught up in a habit loop. The second step is exploring the results of the behavior. We'll go into each of these in detail. The third step is bringing in what I call the BBO, the bigger, better offer, that helps us step out of these old habit loops and into something that might be a little healthier. So let's go into step 1. So step 1 is recognizing habit loops. Here's an example from somebody who is using our Eat Right Now program. She wrote, I understand why I go to food to avoid or cover up or distract from uncomfortable feelings such as anger, sadness, or restlessness. Who wants to feel those things? Trigger, uncomfortable feeling. Behavior, eat something that temporarily diminishes the feeling. Reward, still have to deal with the unpleasant feelings plus the sugar headache. I can clearly see how I got caught in this habit loop trying to escape difficult feelings of food, but that ultimately it doesn't work. So here's a great example of somebody who's able to start at the beginning and start to map out her own mind. And in fact, I found this so helpful, and I talk a lot about this in the book, that we actually put together a free habit mapper that anybody can use and just download. I think the website's just mapmyhabit.com. So you can write that down. You can go there and you can download a free habit mapper, which is the first place I start with all of my patients, is mapping out these habit loops. So once we map out our habit loops, what do we do next? I think of step 2 as the beginning of the end. There's a little bit of neuroscience that will be helpful here, which is there's a part of our brain called the orbitofrontal cortex, which is kind of behind our eyes and our forehead, which stores and determines reward value in our brain. What I mean by this is, I'll give you a personal example. If I eat a piece of broccoli and then I eat a piece of chocolate, my brain is going to compare those two to see which one is more rewarding. The system is set up so that we don't have to relearn everything every day. We can just, when given a choice between 2 things, our brain says, oh yeah, that's more rewarding, do that. I think of this as set and forget. Set the reward value and forget about the details. So once I determine that reward hierarchy between broccoli and milk chocolate, then I can eat some dark chocolate and my brain can then compare those. And so for me, that reward hierarchy goes broccoli, then milk chocolate, then dark chocolate. And it gets nuanced from there. Is it 70%? Does it have some cayenne? And there may be a little bit of sea salt. And you can see how that hierarchy can get pretty complex. But the basic gist is this hierarchy gets set up so it's easy for us to make decisions very quickly without a lot of cognitive effort. Now, there's a lot of math that goes into this. Rescorla and Wagner were some of these researchers back in the 70s that proposed this. They said, we're going to keep doing a behavior, unless that reward value gets updated. And the only way to update a reward value is through paying attention. They called this, again, don't worry about all the math. There was this error term that they called a prediction error. So for example, if I have a certain reward value set up for chocolate cake in my brain, and then I eat a piece of chocolate cake and it is the most delicious chocolate cake I've ever had, my brain sets up what's called this positive prediction error because it's more rewarding than I expected. So depending on where I got that cake, my brain's going to say, ooh, the cake from there, that's really good. Don't forget that. Or if I eat a piece of cake and I'm expecting it to be, at a certain reward level, and then it's really disgusting, I get a negative prediction error. And my brain says, ooh, don't get cake from there. They don't do such a good job. Now we can actually determine these reward values right in the middle of somebody's lives using these app-based mindfulness training programs. We can embed these tools that not only help us determine reward value, but also help people change behavior. So what we do is we can have people basically go through a mindful eating exercise where first they imagine, eating the food, which helps them determine how rewarding it is right now. And then we have the mindful eat. So what happens? Well, I can show you some data from some of our studies. So this is a study that we did with 38 people who were struggling with overeating. And as people went through this exercise, we can measure their reward value. And that reward value drops pretty quickly between, just after about 10 times of somebody really paying attention as they eat, the reward value of overeating versus not overeating drops below zero. And once they hit that 0 point, you can see that the behavior changes. They stop overeating and they start stopping when they're full, for example. So this was the small study we started with. We replicated this with a large population-based sample that basically showed the same thing. Just to give you a sense for what this is like, I love this quote. This person said, "Dear sneaky habit loop that says eating junk food is fun. I am on to you," right? That reward value is dropping. We see the same thing with smoking. It's a little messier because smoking can get reinforced up to 20 times a day, where I don't know many people that are eating cake 20 times a day, but you can still see the same trend where that reward value drops below the reward value of not smoking. So, and just to highlight this, this person said, "Today, all the cigarettes I smoked were disgusting." So you can get a sense for how the second step works. Now, once we start to become disenchanted with our old behavior, this opens up the door for what I described earlier as the BBO, the bigger, better offer, where we can actually find rewards that are more rewarding. So if you think of any of our habit loops, whether it's stress eating or going on social media or checking our email late at night or whatever, these are often triggered. I'm just using an example of triggered by a negative emotion. We do something external like eating food or going out and smoking a cigarette or going on social media, and that gives us a temporary relief. Things like worry don't really give us much relief because they just feed back and make us more anxious. So here, what I would suggest is maybe we can actually tap into something that's intrinsic, that's always available, that's not just brief relief, but actually gives us sustained relief. And here, if we look at mindfulness itself, at that quality of curiosity, I love this quote from Lewis Carroll. Alice says, "Curiouser and curiouser." Maybe curiosity itself could be that bigger, better offer. So for example, if you think of your own experience, what feels better, anxiety or curiosity? To our brains, generally, it's a no-brainer. And if you look at this mechanistically, we could substitute our old behaviors of stress eating or worrying or whatever with curiosity. What's this like? Am I actually getting something from the worry? And when we tap into our direct experience in those moments, we can actually tap into that bigger, better offer of what curiosity itself feels like. I'll give you an example. Here, somebody wrote, "When I first started the program, I didn't quite buy into the benefits of curiosity. Today, I felt a wave of panic. And instead of immediate dread or fear, my automatic response was, that's interesting. That took the wind right out of its sails. I wasn't just saying it was interesting. I actually felt it. I was so thrilled." So here you can see, as we start to learn to substitute something that is a bigger, better offer, our brain is going to naturally move in that direction. So to the point where we can even become habitually curious, even with the things that are most dreaded, such as panic or fear. So just to summarize this part of the talk, and then we'll talk a little bit about the neuroscience, there's actually a whole lot that's known about this ancient learning system, this trigger, behavior, reward. I think of these as habit loops. Any of us can map these out. Any of us can start exploring, what am I getting from this behavior? What's that result? And any of us can start exploring, what are those bigger, better offers that are out there? My two favorite flavors of bigger, better offers are curiosity and kindness. And what I would suggest here is we actually, behaviorally, we can start to see where these bigger, better offers come in and as these substitute behaviors. So now let's turn to how this works in the brain. So you can think of being caught up in our experience as a continuum, right? So when we get caught up in daydreaming, whether it's 50% of waking life, as some studies suggest, or more or less, there's this feeling of where we're just kind of caught up. When we get caught up in stress, it's more noticeable. It feels this closed, contracted feeling. And when we're addicted to something, we're so caught up. I love this definition of addiction, continued use despite adverse consequences. We're so caught up that even when we're aware of it, we can't get out of it. Now, there have been some studies that show exactly where these show up in our bodies. For example, when we're afraid, we tend to feel that contracted fear in our chest. Same for anxiety. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, because if we're being chased by the proverbial saber-toothed tiger, our job is to make ourselves as small as object, as small a target as possible, so that we can protect our vital organs, basically. So we all know what it feels like to get caught up or closed down or wound up in anxiety. And if this can happen a lot, we can actually measure this in our brain. So this is where a network of brain regions called the default mode network comes in. I won't go into all the details, but basically this network was discovered around 2000 by Marcus Rakel and his group at Washington University in St. Louis. It basically gets activated when we do things or think about things related to us. So the self-referential network. Don't worry about the details. We're going to zoom in on two main hubs of this default mode network, the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate. So for example, there was a study published a couple of years ago from UCLA where they had adolescents, they showed adolescents their own Instagram feeds, and the only manipulation they made was some of their pictures got a bunch of likes and some got a few likes. And they wanted to see what happens in the brain when you get a bunch of likes on Instagram. What they found was that the reward centers were activated, the nucleus accumbens, but they were also activating these self-referential brain regions. So there was something, quote unquote, rewarding about getting a bunch of likes on Instagram, activating this default mode network. We also see this, so this is work by Hugh Garavan and his group, when they show pictures of people smoking crack cocaine to people who are addicted to cocaine, the posterior cingulate lights up. Lights up like a Christmas tree in people who are addicted to nicotine, who are shown pictures of people smoking. Also true for pathological gambling, when people are shown images of people gambling. And importantly, this also gets activated proportionally. The more somebody worries, the more their medial prefrontal cortex and the more their posterior cingulate cortex get activated. So, there seems to be a very strong correlation between this default mode network activity and all these different things. So we can ask, well, what exactly is going on? And what we would suggest is that it is this idea of getting caught up in our experience that activates the posterior cingulate cortex in particular. And we can test this because when we bring in meditators and mindfulness practitioners, their task and their practice is to get out of their own way, not get caught up in their experience. So long story short, I think I've presented this perhaps even at this forum before. We did a study that was published about 10 years ago with experienced and novice meditators. And we found, lo and behold, across the entire brain, it's only these hubs of the default mode network that are deactivated in experienced meditators. So novices activate this network, like I was showing you. Experienced meditators do not activate this network, especially during meditation. So that was really encouraging, but these are experienced meditators. So we did a prospective study, where we brought in people who wanted to quit smoking. And at baseline, this was in collaboration with Amy James at Harvard, we could use this great paradigm that she developed, where she could show people smoking cues, neutral cues. We could scan their brains and look to see how much their posterior cingulate cortex was activated at baseline. Then we could randomize them to get a mindfulness-based smoking cessation program called our Craving to Quit program, or the National Cancer Institute's Quit Guide. scan them a month later, and see what happens to their brains and see if that could predict clinical outcomes. What we found was that reductions in brain activity in the posterior cingulate cortex correlated with reductions in cigarette smoking. We saw a strong correlation, but that correlation was only in the group that got mindfulness training. The folks that got the National Cancer Institute's app didn't show that correlation at all. And in fact, we found a dose-dependent response. The more modules that they completed, the better they did. So this was really encouraging to us because this really helped link up the theory of mindfulness, helping people let go, with the neuroscience, with these brain mechanisms, these brain regions that get activated when we get caught up and get deactivated when we let go. And these could predict clinical outcomes like reductions in cigarette use. So, that was all well and good. But one thing that's really important to do is really identify exactly what's happening in that network. And so here we started using a technique that was developed by Zenius Papadimitriou at Yale, where we could actually give people feedback from their own brains in real time to see exactly what was happening as they were getting caught up in their experience and as they were meditating. We can also do a bunch of control experiments. I won't show you these in the interest of time, but we were very fortunate to have Anderson Cooper come in and try this out on film. This was a couple of years ago now, and I'll show you exactly what happened.
This is just the next generation of exercise. We've got the physical, exercise components down, and now it's about working out how can we actually train our minds.
Dr. Brewer is trying to understand how mindfulness can alter the functioning of the brain. He uses a cap lined with 128 electrodes.
We're going to start filling each of these 128 wells with conduction gel.
The electrodes are able to pick up signals from the posterior cingulate, part of a brain network linked to memory and emotion.
This is all just picking up electrical signal from the top of your head.
Since attending the mindfulness retreat, I'd been meditating daily and was curious to see if it had an impact on my brain.
We're going to have you start with thinking of something that was very anxiety-provoking for you.
Okay.
When I thought about something stressful, the cells in my brain's posterior cingulate immediately started firing, shown by the red lines that went off the chart on the computer screen.
Just drop into meditation.
Okay.
When I let go of those stressful thoughts and refocused on my breath, within seconds the brain cells that had been firing quieted down, shown by the blue lines on the computer.
That's really fascinating to see like that.
Dr. Brewer believes everyone can train their brains to reach that blue mindfulness zone, but he says all the technology we're surrounded by makes it difficult.
So just to bring this to a close, what this highlights is we can not only understand these behavioral mechanisms, but we can start to link in these brain mechanisms as well to really further our understanding and bring this neuroscience into a more translational aspect where we can bring all of this home and really, with the idea of developing, scalable treatments, like delivering treatment through an app, we can really help as many people as possible. So I'll just bring this to a close, and let you know how my patients did. Obviously, if they didn't do well, I probably wouldn't talk about them. I'll highlight, this woman who'd come in with binge eating disorder. She went through our mindfulness training. She basically stopped binge eating, lost a bunch of weight. But the biggest thing that I remember from working with her was she said, I actually feel like I have my life back. I can eat a single piece of pizza and actually enjoy it. So it's really highlighted this difference between mindfulness, which helps us really change our relationship to these objects rather than trying to change our environment or change, avoid these objects themselves. How did my patient do with who was anxious? Well, I sent him home with our Unlimiting Anxiety app, and I said, just start mapping out your habit list. He came back 2 weeks later, and the first thing he said to me was, Doc, I lost 14 pounds. And I looked into him quizzically because I hadn't even thought that we talked about weight loss yet. And he said, well, I realized that anxiety was driving me to stress eat, and that stress eating wasn't actually helping, so I stopped doing that. He went on to lose over 100 pounds. I write about him in my book because he's a really interesting case. And long story short was after about 5 or 6 months, he became an Uber driver. I saw him. I was walking out of class one day in Providence on a busy street. This guy pulls over, rolls down his window. It's my patient. And he says, yeah, I'm on my way to the airport. I'm an Uber driver. So it's really remarkable how our minds are plastic and how if we really learn how our minds work, we can work with them. So I'll just end with a quote. I think this is really powerful. This person said, "What's most interesting to me is how we define the rewards. In the past, the reward of eating right has been weight loss, but it was more often than not short-lived because I hadn't made real process changes in my daily life. Here, it feels like the reward is defined differently, and weight loss is a side effect. The reward here is, for lack of better expression, a more balanced life or inner peace." Now, I just love this poem from Rumi. I'll just read you part of it where he says, "Be empty of worry. Think of who created thought. Why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? Move outside the tangle of fear thinking. Live in silence. Flow down and down in always widening rings of being." So I will stop there, and I will just express my sincere gratitude to all the folks that contributed to all of this work, and also to our funders. Most of the work that you've seen here was funded by the NIH. And if you're interested in learning more, you can just check out my website. We've got a bunch of free resources. You can see some of these animations that we've put together. There's actually a free CME course for healthcare providers where they can get credit through Brown University. And if you remember nothing else, just remember the wonderful poet Mary Oliver, what she wrote. Instructions for living: pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. So I will stop there, and I would be happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brewer. That was fantastic. So I just want to encourage everybody, use the Q&A and type in and give us your questions. We already have a good list going. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned it, you talked about it, but I would love for you to expand more on curiosity. One of the elements of our SMART program, of our brain training program, is innovation. Innovation being really flexibility of thinking. And part of that is curiosity and trying to get people to think differently, ask questions, And so one of the things we also talk about is this intentional, a proactive curiosity building that you are. And so talk to us more about, because I think curiosity is so interesting in terms of how it could be of benefit, but also how it might get you hung up.
Yes.
In both anxiety loops, but also in habit forming of new things.
It's a great question. So, and I actually wrote an article on my website that specifically talks about curiosity because I was so fascinated with it. I didn't even know there were different types of curiosity until I started looking into this. So the short answer here, and people can get details in the article, is there are two types of curiosity. One's called deprivation curiosity, one's called interest curiosity. And deprivation curiosity is driven in a negatively reinforced way. So basically, the trigger is that we don't know a piece of information that urges us into action to go get it. Think of our stomach rumbles when we're hungry and we go get food. Our brain rumbles when we don't have a piece of information and we go find it. Now, that can be helpful for survival, but it can also be a hindrance when we're just constantly caught up in that negatively reinforced process because, it gets us back to baseline. That's why it's called deprivation. We get that information and we're back to baseline. I think of it as the destination. We get somewhere. Interest curiosity, on the other hand, and this is the type of curiosity that I absolutely love, is more about the journey than the destination. So deprivation can actually feel contracted because there's probably a dopaminergic drive to go do something. Whereas interest curiosity is more about the joy of discovery. I love this phrase, she was in wide-eyed wonder, right? It's not called narrow-eyed wonder, it's wide-eyed wonder because we're open. And so we're really curious about something and we're not trying to get something or get somewhere. That curiosity helps us move towards something in a way that's more open, and I actually write about this in the book. This is aligned with Carol Dweck's growth mindset, right? Fixed mindset, we're not open to learning. Growth mindset, we're open. Literally feeling open opens our awareness, opens our field, and opens our ability to be more creative and think outside the box. So I don't know if that gets all of your question, but I think that's a great place to start.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. So now I'm gonna kind of dive into some of these questions because we have a lot of them. I'm kind of going to combine some of them. Amygdala. Give us some education on the amygdala. So couple questions about how can we downregulate the amygdala, but also another question about what is the role of the amygdala in behavior change?
Yes. Okay, I'm going to say something intentionally controversial here, which is don't worry so much about the amygdala. There's a lot of hype in the popular culture about the amygdala. And there are a lot of different theories about exactly what the amygdala does. One theory that I think has a lot of good science behind it is that it helps us pay attention if we're not paying attention, right? Basically, it helps us determine if something is dangerous or not quickly, right? So for example, a lot of experiments where they have people with really wide open eyes in fear, and you can elicit an amygdala response that basically says, hey, danger's out there. So what I would say, the reason I say don't worry so much about the amygdala is because that's more of a very instinctual, like quick reaction. In terms of changing behavior, these habits they're not instinctual. They're at a much slower time scale. And so we have to actually focus on what causes habits to form and how to change them. And that's probably not driven by the amygdala. It's more these reward systems and these learned behaviors that happen repetitively. The key there is, and I mentioned it, is this orbitofrontal cortex. If we can really tap into that reward value system, that's what's going to help change behavior. So, for all you amygdala fans out there, great. It's not that the amygdala is bad or not helpful. It's just not the focus for changing, especially habitual behaviors.
Awesome. Okay. A couple questions people have been asking about kids and middle schoolers and younger kids, like especially right now, really stressful times. How do we help them? How do we help them get over their anxieties? How do we help them?
So I think just understanding how the mind works in general is a great place to start. So understanding that uncertainty drives everybody's mind crazy, and how we can learn to, instead of just hunker down in our safety zone, can we use curiosity, for example, as a way to venture out of the cave, and instead of freaking out because we're not used to uncertainty, kind of explore and also celebrate uncertainty, where we can learn to be okay with discomfort, right? Increase our distress tolerance rather than just turning to things to soothe us. And I think one way to do this is to learn this ourselves as adults and model this for the kids, right? If we can model distress tolerance instead of just, when we're bored going to our phones or whatever, that's a great way to model this for our children. And just like social contagion can spread anxiety from one person to another, we can also spread ease, confidence, joy, curiosity from one person to another. And so the more we start to embody these things, the more that will spread through social contagion to our families, to our friends, et cetera.
So it's almost even like if we just live like this proactively and intentionally, it's being protective almost against what could come also, rather than just trying to hit the problem and fix it once it's there.
Absolutely. I think this could help us develop resilience. And I have to say, you can think of curiosity as an immune, it's like a vaccine for panic, because, if we're faced with uncertainty and we're naturally curious, then we can lean into that, as compared to if we're faced with uncertainty and this really uncomfortable and we're not used to discomfort, that's where we freak out and start to panic. So I think of it as like an immune, like a vaccine for anxiety and panic.
So a couple questions also are coming up, talking about mindfulness. Some of these questions about how do people who are uncomfortable and have discomfort with mindfulness, with sitting still, with having to have this kind of focus, all kind of the normal obstacles you probably hear about. What would be some good first steps or advice that you would give people who are experiencing that or are hesitant to try because of those things?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. So often people have this concept that mindfulness is about sitting, meditating on a cushion. And when our first study, this was the smoking study, we looked at formal meditation practices, and we also looked at informal practices. And we found that the informal practices moderated the effects more than the formal practices. So when people were, I think of it as short moments many times, as they were bringing a moment of mindfulness into their life, that's where the change was even stronger than if they meditated. So for example, if somebody's trying to quit smoking, they have an urge to smoke and they're driving on the highway, they can't just pull over to the side of the road, pull out their meditation cushion and start meditating, right?
It's really about, oh, here's this craving. Can I get curious about this right now? Or, oh, I'm worrying. Can I get curious about this right now? So I think of meditation. I actually wrote a little chapter on this in the book. Meditation is more of this small circle within a larger circle of mindfulness. And so we can broaden our horizon beyond just the idea of sitting, because a lot of people, they're just not into, they don't have time, or their body just has too much energy for sitting. And so it's kind of forcing themselves to sit. Here, I would say this is really about mapping out our minds. And so whatever we can do to bring awareness in and start seeing how our minds work, that's mindfulness training. And we can do that on the go. We can do that sitting. We can do, that really broadens how we approach these trainings. And that's actually why we developed these app-based trainings, was we start with these informal practices, and then we build informal practices as people are ready for them.
Awesome. I know Steve's got a question, but one thing I have seen a couple times, and I just do want to promote it. So if I'm not accurately doing it, Judd, please let me know. Unwinding Anxiety is an app that Dr. Brewer has developed. It uses mindfulness, but I've done it myself, and it is informative. It is, if you didn't have curiosity about it before, you will. It helps you. It really does. It nudges you to think about it. And I just love the pacing of it. And so that is something you can find it in the App Store, Unwinding Anxiety. Okay, sorry.
No, thank you.
So Judd, my question goes to kind of this reward value. Your example about smoking is a little easier for me to grasp, because if you focus on it, you can establish some pretty negative values to what maybe was perceived as a reward before.
Yes.
But when it comes to, Rocky Road ice cream, that value seems pretty good at first.
Yeah.
So are you manipulating the value, or are you finding a different kind of value? If you could go into that a little deeper.
Yeah, it's a great question. And the thing I love, it's a great question, because you can think of smoking. We don't need to smoke to survive. It's actually antithetical to survival. But we do have to eat to survive. We need calories to survive. And with food, it's not like paying attention and suddenly we're going to be like, oh, my favorite chocolate, I don't like it anymore. For me, it's like, oh, that's a really good chocolate. But there's also this pleasure plateau that starts to happen. Actually, a friend, Dana Small, who's a food researcher at Yale, she did this for her PhD thesis, where she basically fed people chocolate, their favorite chocolate, and had them answer a questionnaire saying, how good is this? How good is it now? How good is it now? And what she found was that it was good, and then it stopped being good, and then it started being terrible as she basically force-fed them chocolate. So it doesn't change the reward value of chocolate, but it can help us see very clearly what the reward value of over-consuming something is. And this can go for chocolate, Rocky Road ice cream, social media, right? Some social media might be fine. But if we're constantly scrolling and we're spending our whole afternoon doing that and not getting our work done, not so helpful. So I think of this as a pleasure plateau. And one thing I do with my patients is I have them ask themselves as they're eating, is this bite better than the last, right? So they can really map that out. How about this one? And once they hit that plateau, then they can ask themselves, okay, let me see what it's like to stop eating here versus continue eating. So their brains can really clearly map that out.
And then do you give yourself your own intentional reward by saying, I stopped on that third bite and I feel good about that?
Yeah, a lot of
pleasure on both ends.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people say it feels good to feel like I'm in control as compared to out of control eating. And the satisfaction of the eating hasn't diminished at all because they've hit all the high points.
Cool. Thank you.
So we are just about out of time. We have so many questions, so my apologies for not getting to everybody's questions. This is recorded. It will be up on our YouTube site, which you can go to YouTube and Center for Brain Health, and it'll be there. But also, I definitely encourage you to reach out to Dr. Brewer. Like, he put up some contact information earlier. Maybe we can put that up again. I think a couple people had been asking for that. Or we can just post it later. I think the biggest thing, Judd, what is your biggest, go charge, go forth, like everybody on this call to action as we leave tonight, thinking about?
Yes, so I quote James Stevens in my Unwinding Anxiety book, where he's this Irish author, and he said, curiosity will conquer fear even more than bravery will. And so in a world with increasing uncertainty, I would say go forth and conquer fear with curiosity.
Awesome.
That's awesome. Listen, Judd, thank you. Thanks to all the members of the audience. None of this is possible without you, and we are not for profit, so I don't apologize for saying, listen, part of the way we succeed is by support. So if you are so inclined, please feel free to donate to the cause, because as you see, Judd's an international celebrity. So the fact that we have him here, we can't do that without your help. So go to our website, up the donate tab, and if you're so inclined, do so. If not, please join us again next month. Judd, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who joined us tonight.
And I just want to put in a pitch once more for, hopefully you can see this, Unwinding Anxiety, Judd's new book that just came out, his app, and he also has another book called The Craving Mind. Both are really fantastic. There were some questions about, can this help for certain disorders? Read this about habit loops and curiosity and mindfulness. You will get a lot of great information from it.
Thanks, everybody.